September 1st, 1939. Near the German-Polish border, a radio station falls silent. There's a brief exchange of gunfire. By morning, Europe is at war. The early reports sound straightforward. Polish attackers, German retaliation, another border provocation. But the scene had been arranged in advance. The bodies were placed, the broadcast prepared, the justification drafted before the first shot was ever fired. History remembers the invasion of Poland as the beginning of the Second World War. Yet, even in those first hours, truth and performance were already tangled together, and it would not be the last time. World War II is usually told in sweeping images. Armies crossing continents, cities burning, leaders addressing anxious nations. But beneath those monumental events were smaller, quieter decisions, moments of uncertainty, proposals so unlikely they almost sound fictional. Some lasted only hours, some were buried in archives, some nearly changed everything. June 1940. France stood on the edge of collapse. German forces had launched their western offensive weeks earlier. Defensive lines crumbled with alarming speed. Entire divisions were encircled. Refugees crowded the roads heading south. Paris, long thought untouchable, suddenly felt exposed. The French government fled, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. Confidence dissolved into something closer to panic. Across the Channel, Britain watched with growing dread. If France fell, Germany would dominate Western Europe. Britain would stand alone. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped Dunkirk. Equipment was abandoned on the beaches. Reinforcements were limited. Options were narrowing. Inside London, discussions became urgent. Then an extraordinary idea surfaced. Not a new alliance, not expanded aid, but union. A proposal that France and the United Kingdom merge into a single state. Shared citizenship, shared government, a unified war cabinet. It sounded radical, almost implausible. But desperation reshapes what seems possible. The idea had circulated quietly before the crisis peaked. One of its strongest advocates was Jean Monnet, a French political thinker working in London. He believed that if France ceased to exist as an independent state, it could not legally seek a separate peace. Another supporter was Charles de Gaulle, then a relatively unknown general insisting that the fight must continue. On June 16, 1940, the Declaration of Union was drafted. Its language was bold. France and Britain would no longer be two nations, but one. Defense, foreign policy, and economic strategy would be coordinated. Their armed forces would answer to a single authority. The logic was stark. If France did not exist independently, it could not surrender independently. The proposal reached Winston Churchill the same day. He had reservations. Legal systems differed. political traditions diverged. Even language stood in the way. But time was running out. There were also practical fears, especially the French fleet. If it fell under German control, the balance of naval power could shift dangerously, and symbolism mattered. A union would signal defiance in the face of collapse. Churchill agreed to present it. Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, listened with cautious hope. His cabinet was fracturing. Some members were already leaning toward an armistice. Perhaps union could buy time. Perhaps it could stiffen resolve. That evening in Bordeaux, the French cabinet reacted, and the reaction was overwhelmingly hostile. Marshal Pétain condemned the idea as a surrender of sovereignty. Many ministers distrusted Britain. The evacuation at Dunkirk was still raw. Centuries of rivalry could not be erased overnight. Within hours, the proposal unraveled. Reynaud resigned. Pétain took power. Days later, France sought an armistice. The Union, an idea that might have altered the trajectory of the war, vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. But even before France collapsed, deception had already helped ignite the conflict. August 31st, 1939. Gleiwitz, a small group of German operatives, approached a radio station near the Polish border. It was not a major broadcasting hub, just a relay transmitter. Inside, employees worked an ordinary shift. The attackers forced their way in. A brief struggle, confusion, then silence. Moments later, a short message went out in Polish, urgent, defiant, implying an attack on German soil. Outside, a body was left behind. The victim, Franciszek Honiak, was a civilian arrested by the Gestapo. Dressed to resemble a Polish saboteur, he became part of the evidence. By morning, German state media reported Polish aggression. Germany, they claimed, was responding in self-defense. Within hours, German forces crossed into Poland. International observers were skeptical. British and French intelligence had tracked German mobilization for months. The invasion had been planned regardless. After 1945, the world did not return to what it had been. It couldn't. Cities were rebuilt, but borders shifted. Economies restarted, but trust did not automatically follow. The war had redrawn maps, but it had also redrawn expectations about power, about responsibility, about what modern states were capable of doing. Two superpowers emerged from the wreckage. The United States, economically strengthened and geographically untouched by invasion. The Soviet Union, devastated yet ascendant, its armies occupying vast stretches of Eastern Europe. They had fought on the same side. They did not imagine the same future. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany dissolved into suspicion. Cooperation hardened into rivalry. By the late 1940s, the world was reorganizing again, not into open warfare, but into something colder, subtler, and in its own way just as dangerous. The Cold War did not begin with a single shot. It began with positioning, with speeches, with spheres of influence quietly drawn across continents. Germany was divided. Berlin was divided. Europe itself was split by an ideological line that would define generations. And yet, even in division, there was restraint. The memory of global war lingered heavily enough to impose caution. Nuclear weapons, introduced in the final months of World War II, transformed the meaning of conflict. Total war between major powers no longer promised victory. It promised annihilation. In that sense, World War II altered not only politics, but psychology. It forced leaders to consider consequences at a scale previously unimaginable. It also accelerated change in other ways. Colonial empires weakened. Asian and African independence movements gained momentum. The war had exposed contradictions. European powers preaching freedom while ruling overseas territories. Within decades, decolonization reshaped much of the globe. But independence did not always bring stability. Borders drawn by distant administrators became fault lines. Old grievances resurfaced. The patterns of fear, ambition, and miscalculation. The same forces that had fed earlier conflicts appeared again in new contexts. History does not repeat itself neatly. It adapts. The Second World War is often framed as a moral narrative. Tyranny defeated, freedom restored. And in many respects, that framing reflects reality. The defeat of Nazi Germany ended a regime responsible for unprecedented crimes. But history is rarely simple. The war also revealed how fragile institutions can be, how quickly democratic systems can erode under pressure, how propaganda can normalize the unthinkable, how ordinary individuals can become participants in extraordinary harm, sometimes through belief, sometimes through fear, sometimes through silence. That may be the most uncomfortable legacy. Not that evil existed, but that it operated through structures, laws, offices, uniforms, broadcasts that appeared official, even orderly. The machinery of destruction did not always look chaotic. It often looked organized, and that recognition reshaped post-war law, ethics, and governance. Human rights frameworks expanded. International law grew more ambitious. Genocide was named and defined. The idea that following orders could excuse atrocity was challenged in courtrooms before the world. Progress, however, has never been permanent. Each generation inherits both the safeguards and the vulnerabilities left behind. Which brings us back to the beginning. A staged broadcast, a fabricated provocation, a government exploiting perception to justify force. The techniques were not new in 1939. They were refined, and refinement continues. Technology changes, communication accelerates. Narratives spread faster than armies once did. The tools differ, but the temptation remains to frame aggression as defense, to blur responsibility, to act quickly while others hesitate. World War II is distant enough now to feel monumental, almost abstract. Black and white footage, textbook chapters, ceremonies on anniversaries. But for those who lived through it, it was not abstract. It was hunger, uncertainty, loss, decisions made without knowing whether morning would bring survival or collapse. If there is one thread that runs through the conflict from Gleiwitz to Normandy to Berlin, it is this: events that later seem inevitable rarely feel that way in the moment. They feel fragile, contingent, dependent on choices made by individuals under pressure. Some choices escalate, some restrain, some are made out of conviction, others out of fear. History records outcomes. It rarely captures hesitation, and yet hesitation, the pause before action, is often where catastrophe can still be avoided. The Second World War stands as a testament to how quickly that pause can disappear, not because people failed to recognize danger, but because they believed they could manage it, delay it, contain it, until they no longer could. There is another way to understand the war, not through leaders, not through strategy, not through maps covered in arrows, but through the ordinary lives interrupted by it. A shopkeeper in Warsaw, who closed early on August 31st, without knowing his street would be rubble within weeks. A mother in London teaching her children how to recognize the sound of incoming aircraft. A railway worker in rural France who found himself quietly passing information to the resistance, not because he saw himself as a hero, but because something in him refused to look away. History compresses these lives into statistics. 6 million, 20 million, 70 million, numbers so vast they blur. But each number was singular. A room left empty, a chair no one would sit in again, a letter that stopped arriving. War does not only destroy cities, it rearranges memory. In Germany, many civilians insisted after 1945 that they had not known the full extent of the regime's crimes. Some were telling the truth. Others were telling a version of it they could live with. In the Soviet Union, victory became foundational to national identity, a narrative of sacrifice and resilience. The cost, however, was almost beyond comprehension. Entire villages erased, generations thinned. In the United States, the war solidified global leadership, but it also left behind veterans who returned home with experiences that did not fit easily into peacetime conversation. In Japan, the atomic bombings introduced a new dimension of devastation, one that blurred the line between military target and civilian annihilation. The war ended abruptly there, but the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would linger for decades. Memory, like history, is not uniform. It bends around national stories, around pride, around grief. Some countries remember themselves primarily as victims, others as liberators, some as both, and in each telling, something is emphasized, something softened. That is not always deception. Often it is survival, because to live after catastrophe, societies construct narratives that allow continuity. But beneath official memory, private memory persists. Grandparents who avoided certain subjects at dinner tables, photographs kept in drawers, names spoken quietly. As the generation that experienced the war firsthand fades, the responsibility of memory shifts from witness to historian to citizen, and with distance comes risk. Not the risk of forgetting entirely. The war is too large for that, but the risk of simplifying it, reducing it to a morality play, or to spectacle, or to inevitability. Yet it was not inevitable. There were moments, fragile, uncertain, where different choices might have slowed or altered events. Diplomatic failures, appeasement miscalculations, economic crises mishandled, national pride placed above compromise. None of these alone created the war. Together, they formed conditions where escalation became easier than restraint. That is the quieter lesson. Catastrophe is rarely a single decision. It is accumulation, a series of justifications that seem manageable in isolation, a series of warnings dismissed as exaggeration, a series of small erosions in trust, until one morning a radio station falls silent and armies begin to move. The Second World War reshaped borders and power structures, but its deeper legacy lies in awareness, an awareness that propaganda can be sophisticated, that fear can be mobilized, that ordinary institutions can be redirected toward extraordinary harm. It also left behind something else, a demonstration of endurance. Cities rebuilt from ash, former enemies integrated into alliances, institutions created to prevent repetition, imperfect efforts, incomplete safeguards, but efforts nonetheless. The European Union, nay, the United Nations, whatever their limitations, emerged from the conviction that isolation and unchecked rivalry had already cost too much. These structures did not erase conflict. They attempted to manage it before it metastasized. Whether they will endure as memory fades remains uncertain, because each generation faces a version of the same question. What do we do with the warning? We can treat it as distant, a chapter concluded, relevant mainly to textbooks, or we can recognize that the forces at play in the 1930s were not alien to human nature. Economic anxiety, national humiliation, political polarization, charismatic leaders offering certainty in uncertain times. The context changes, the language evolves, the tools modernize, but the emotional currents feel familiar. That recognition does not mean repetition is inevitable. It means vigilance is necessary. The war began with a performance, a staged incident used to justify aggression. It expanded through ambition and fear. It ended with ruins and relief intertwined, and its aftermath continues to shape how power is measured, how alliances are formed, and how history, time does something strange to wars. It makes them feel finished. The documents are signed. The monuments are built. The anniversaries arrive on schedule. But wars do not end cleanly. They taper, they echo, they settle into infrastructure, into foreign policy, into family stories told in fragments. A city rebuilt after bombing does not look like a battlefield anymore. Cafes reopen. Children run through squares where rubble once lay. Tourists take photographs, but foundations remember. Beneath streets in Berlin, unexploded ordnance is still occasionally discovered. Construction pauses. Evacuations happen. The past interrupts the present without warning. In forests across Eastern Europe, remnants surface after heavy rain, metal, bone, identification tags. The ground gives back what it never fully absorbed. History is not buried as deeply as we imagine. And beyond the physical remnants, there are institutional ones. The architecture of modern Europe, economic integration, shared regulatory frameworks, coordinated defense, was built deliberately to make another continental war harder to imagine. Not impossible, harder. That distinction matters, because the generation that rebuilt Europe did so with memory still raw. They did not need persuasion about the cost of collapse. They had seen it. As decades pass, memory becomes mediated through textbooks, films, museums. Commemoration replaces experience. There is value in that. Education matters, preservation matters, but distance also creates abstraction. It becomes easier to treat 1939 as inevitable, to see escalation as obvious in hindsight, to assume that people should have known. Many did know something was wrong. They simply disagreed about what could be done, or feared acting too soon, or believed the crisis could be contained. That mixture, awareness combined with hesitation, is often where history turns. The 1930s were not defined by ignorance alone. They were defined by fatigue, by populations still traumatized from the First World War, by leaders reluctant to risk another catastrophe. Appeasement did not begin as surrender. It began as avoidance. Avoidance can look rational in the short term. It becomes dangerous when exploited by those who recognize it. And exploitation thrives on narrative. The Gleiwitz Incident worked not because it convinced the world, but because it gave domestic audiences something to hold on to. A story that reframed aggression as response. That dynamic did not disappear in 1945. The mediums changed. Radio became television. Television became digital networks. Information accelerated beyond anything imaginable in 1939. But the underlying principle remains. Control the story, and you influence perception. Influence perception, and you widen the space for action. World War II demonstrated how powerfully narrative and force can intertwine. It also demonstrated the limits of force alone. Germany achieved rapid territorial expansion. Japan advanced across the Pacific. Early victories created momentum and overconfidence, but expansion stretched supply lines. Occupation bred resistance. Brutality hardened opposition. Power can seize territory quickly. Holding it is another matter. And eventually, the weight of overreach accumulates. The war's final years were marked less by surprise and more by inevitability. Industrial capacity, manpower, and logistics began to determine outcomes more than dramatic maneuver. Factories became as decisive as generals. Railways mattered as much as rhetoric. It was a reminder that modern war is not only fought at the front, it is sustained or broken by systems behind it. In that sense, the conflict reshaped not only geopolitics, but the relationship between society and state. Entire populations were mobilized. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. Civil defense networks formed. Rationing normalized scarcity. Scientific research accelerated under military urgency. Radar rocketry, early computing, nuclear physics. War compressed innovation. Some of those advances would later power civilian life. Others introduced new existential risks. The atomic bomb marked a boundary humanity had never crossed before. The ability to destroy civilization deliberately and rapidly. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, war could no longer be imagined solely as armies meeting on battlefields. It became planetary. That knowledge, that capability still exists, which makes the legacy of the Second World War not only historical, but structural. It altered what is possible, and once something becomes possible, it cannot be uninvented. The question shifts from can it happen to will it be prevented? Prevention depends less on memory alone and more on institutions, norms, and collective restraint. Those are fragile. They require maintenance, trust, compromise, qualities often in short supply during periods of economic stress or political polarism. There is a tendency, when looking back at World War II, to see it as an era apart. Something contained between 1939 and 1945, bracketed neatly by dates. But wars do not sit quietly inside timelines. They spill forward. They shape where bases are built, which alliances endure, which rivalries never quite dissolve. They influence which histories are emphasized in classrooms and which are glossed over. In some countries, the war is remembered primarily as liberation. In others, as occupation. In others still, as betrayal or humiliation. These memories do not cancel each other out. They coexist, sometimes uneasily, and memory influences policy. A nation that remembers invasion tends to prioritize security. A nation that remembers abandonment may distrust alliances. A nation that remembers victory may assume resilience is guaranteed. These assumptions shape decisions long after the last veteran is gone. That is part of the war's afterlife. Another part lives in culture. Films, novels, museums, memorial days. Black and white footage looped endlessly. Each retelling selects angles. Heroism is easier to frame than hesitation. Battle is easier to depict than bureaucracy. Clear villains are easier to portray than structural failures. But the deeper story of the war lies in structures, in how economies faltered, how institutions weakened, how rhetoric normalized exclusion. The 1930s did not begin with war fever. They began with instability. Economic collapse in the wake of the Great Depression fractured trust in democratic systems. Mass unemployment created anger. Political movements promised restoration of pride, of jobs, of certainty. Certainty is powerful, especially when the alternative feels chaotic. Authoritarian regimes often rise not solely on fear, but on the promise of order. And once order is promised, dissent can be reframed as sabotage. By the time repression becomes obvious, it is often embedded in law. That embedding is gradual. Emergency measures, temporary suspensions, expanded executive powers, each step framed as necessary. By the time tanks cross borders, much of the groundwork has already been laid. World War II did not erupt from nowhere. It was prepared economically, politically, psychologically, and preparation is rarely dramatic. It is procedural, which makes it harder to detect in real time. The war also demonstrated something else: how quickly alliances can shift under pressure. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact in 1939. Two ideologically opposed regimes agreed, temporarily, to divide territory. Strategic calculation overrode public ideology. Less than 2 years later, they were locked in one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. Alliances, it turns out, can be tactical. Interests evolve. Trust is conditional. Power realigns. The same fluidity that allows cooperation also allows fracture. That reality complicates the simple narratives of good versus evil. While the moral dimensions of the war are undeniable, especially regarding genocide and aggression, the geopolitical landscape was layered and shifting. States acted in self-interest. Leaders misjudged timelines. Some gambled and lost catastrophically, and civilians bore the consequences. Even victory carried ambiguity. The Allied powers defeated Nazi Germany. They dismantled its regime, prosecuted its leaders, and exposed its crimes. But they also inherited a devastated continent. They faced decisions about reconstruction, occupation, punishment, and reconciliation. Too harsh a settlement could fuel resentment. Too lenient a one could risk resurgence. These were not abstract debates. They shaped the architecture of the post-war world. The Marshall Plan was not merely generosity. It was strategy, an attempt to stabilize economies, to prevent political extremism from flourishing again. NATO was not merely alliance. It was deterrence, a collective calculation about how to prevent expansion without triggering another global war. The United Nations was not idealism alone. It was an institutional acknowledgement that unmanaged rivalry had already proven catastrophic. Each institution reflected memory of escalation, memory of miscalculation, memory of underestimating ambition. But institutions, like memory, require upkeep. They can erode through neglect, through cynicism, through the slow belief that catastrophe is outdated. Perhaps the most subtle legacy of World War II is not fear. It is complacency, the sense that such scale cannot happen again because it already did. Yet history does not grant immunity. Technological progress does not guarantee political wisdom. Economic growth does not eliminate grievance. Connectivity does not ensure understanding. In some ways, the modern world is more resilient than that of the 1930s. In other ways, it is more volatile. Information moves instantly. Financial shocks ripple globally within who? September 1st, 1939. A radio station near the German-Polish border falls silent. A short broadcast follows. A claim of aggression. A justification already written. By morning, armies are moving. At the time, it did not feel like the beginning of a world war. It felt like another crisis, another escalation, another event that would be managed. But it was. From that broadcast flowed 6 years of destruction. Cities erased, entire populations displaced, millions dead, institutions rebuilt from rubble, alliances forged in exhaustion, a global order redesigned under the weight of what had happened. The war did not begin with inevitability. It began with a narrative, a story crafted to make action appear necessary, to make aggression appear defensive, to make escalation appear unavoidable. That is how large catastrophes often start, not with chaos, but with framing. The rest followed. Armies advanced. Governments collapsed. Desperation produced radical proposals. Ambition outran logistics. Atrocities were organized with administrative precision. Resistance formed. Industrial capacity determined survival. The map was redrawn in ruins. And when it was over, the world did not return to normal. It built something new, cautiously, imperfectly, in response to what had been learned. World War II remains the clearest demonstration of how quickly systems can fail when fear, ambition, and miscalculation align. It also remains evidence that rebuilding is possible, but rebuilding is always harder than preventing collapse. The first shot was not random. The first invasion was not accidental. The first justification was not spontaneous. It was prepared. History records what happened after. The quieter question is what might have been recognized before. September 1st, 1939. A radio station falls silent, and the world changes, not all at once, but step by step, until it is unrecognizable.